If you need to use some of these effects, I'll just run through them quickly. In this case, actually, let's look at the water and ocean effect. So ocean it generally just sets a specific height. So if we turn that on, it's going to shoot an ocean across the entire kind of environment here. And so if you haven't sculpted the terrain, you'd probably just end up with an endless ocean here. But here you can see, as you start to sculpt and update that, I'm going to go ahead and slow this down. You'll start to get the waves crashing against there. The ocean has a number of effects themselves. You could increase or decrease kind of the wave intensity in a number of settings here. I don't really use the ocean because we don't have any water here, but it could be cool if you have a site outside of New Mexico. I'm going to go ahead and turn that one off. The one that we tend to use more so is maybe a smaller body of water, like a pond or maybe even a river type environment. And to use that, that's the water's connection here. But I'm going to first kind of lower the topography. And with the water tool, simply select it, and you're going to actually place it as an object in the scene. So let's drop our water. And the water is a really simple tool. It's essentially just a square kind of map, and you can take these points, move them along here. And the reason why I kind of edited the topography is that I could essentially hide these edges by just lifting and moving the water up and down. So you may start with just a flat plane like this, and by kind of slowing that down under the move object command, that allows you to get that water in there. And here's just a number of presets for different type water effects that you're looking for. Okay. Probably the most used tool out of this guy is the grass. So if we just look under ocean, we could select the grass option here and turn that on. And I'm going to drop the camera lower so you can start to see this. So here we have grass size. So you can actually see it starts to render out a grass in the foreground. We could turn the height up. And then you can randomize it somewhat. So here we could start to get rid of that. So you end up with more patches of grass throughout. That's a little bit more realism to the scene because I think any subtle imperfections help to do that. And so here you could see I've got some grass just kind of poking out of the ground throughout. And then next to the general widgets here, you'll notice you have a bunch of these empty slots. So this allows you to then populate it with other kind of random kind of landscape elements within there. So if I go and select one of these guys, you'll see I've got a couple different options here. So if I wanted to add maybe some weeds in here, I could go and select one of these guys. And then if you look around the environment, you'll start to see a few of them popping up randomly. And so we can actually start to increase the spread. You can increase the size or decrease the size of the assets within there. Or you can just randomize it across the board. And so here I could turn that up, and then you can actually start to stack, several objects throughout the environment. Really depends, on how much you really want to have some of this stuff kind of look a little bit more realistic. To me, I tend to kind of go minimal in terms of this type of effect here. Maybe just a few parts and pieces throughout just to make it seem somewhat more realistic, but just don't go crazy and don't, go overkill because it quickly starts to look really weird. In my case, I don't really need any of these. And so I'm just going to go ahead and get out of that. So I'm going to turn off the grass there. If you're really into it, you can actually start to paint also textures on that surface as well. So in my case, if I go to the lower left now, the paint tools, you'll have about 4 kind of palettes to choose from. Now in reality, oftentimes when we're dealing with sites, we have a whole site plan that has maybe 20 different landscape materials. And we end up actually importing a site model into Lumion and using the texture tool that I'm going to go through. But if you don't have that option and you don't have that level of detail, this certainly is a good way to do that. And so within here, it's a similar tool set. You've got your brush size, the speed at which it emits, and then the tile size for these textures here. And so if I wanted to actually maybe create more of a sandy beach along the edge, you can start to just kind of paint along that surface. And turning down the brush speed, I think, is really helpful because it gives you a little bit more control and helps you start to fade the different textures together. And if you want to swap a texture, you can certainly do that by just selecting the Edit Type options right above there. And then you have a general palette of some of the stuff that's preloaded. But you can also load your own custom textures as well. So there's Farmland East, and I could change this to Egypt Sand. And you'll see that wherever that texture was applied, it happens globally. So again, if you have a real specific site, I wouldn't rely on this tool, but rather just import a site model and texture it another way. And the last feature I'll just touch on here is the Openstreetmap tool. And this is good if you have a project that's in an actual site that's developed. And I should say also kind of has a lot of GIS information about it. I'm not sure if it will work here, but if you go to and select next to the paintbrush tool, the Openstreetmap, and go to and turn that on. Let's see how your internet connection may be better than mine, but it's essentially going to ask for a token from kind of the Openstreetmap website. And if it works, what you'll do is you'll enter an address, and then it'll try and pull in all the GIS information about that. So it takes like streets, zoning information, and building footprints, and will populate it in the model for you. It's a good way to get some immediate site context without having to build, everything around you. Is anybody actually getting it to load for them? So it might just be my connection. All right, I might have to give up on that one. But it is something, if you're really into it and you want to get that, it should be intuitive where you just Google Street Map a site and hit import, and it'll pull in a certain radius around that address point. So that's a real quick overview of some of the landscape tools. And I just go through this quickly just because we don't really use them a ton in our office, but it's a good option if you need to get something in there. So what I'm going to do in my case is, again, just go ahead and flatten this site because I don't necessarily want it. I should make a point though, if there is another option that can be really useful if you've got good information about that site, and that's to use a height map to generate your terrain. And that's kind of these terrain maps right here. So a height map is like that black and white gradient image of topography. I've had mixed results with Lumion because sometimes it'll come in looking like a really crazy environment. Let me just see if I could find one real quick. Okay, so here's an example of a height map. So let's go ahead and import that height map. Here it is. If we go in and open that, whoa. So that's the result I got out of that. So Lumion is really sensitive to the height map. So, you know, if you're serious about it and you got some good information, what we've done is actually taken height maps into Photoshop and actually softened the gradation and actually reduced the number of steps, so you didn't have like 10 gradations from white to black in a scene, but rather 3 or 4, and then you start to get a much nicer and smoother terrain. Otherwise, you may end up with stuff like this. Now, this one isn't actually too bad. I've seen much worse. But it is an option if you're looking at kind of bringing in a larger swath of land. So I'm going to go ahead and flatten that. And let's go ahead and start looking at the object panel here. So on the left, go ahead and go to the bottom. So Lumion's great because it comes with a ton of entourage. And you can see the different categories here. So like in this case, we have nature selected. And you'll notice you have a preview icon right here. And if you actually select that object, what it brings up is its library of content that it's loaded. And so here we've got, you know, small leaf as a category, but then all these pages of different plants that you can actually load into the model. And these models actually aren't too bad. I believe these are like speed tree models. And so if we bring them in here, you know, they'll actually kind of react to the environment. You can see the leaves moving. And as we add effects like snow or wind and other effects, they'll actually react to that environment. So they're pretty cool. The only thing that we tend to do is just take all the green and life out of them so they look like they're in New Mexico. And the way we do that is once we place an object, so go down and find like a tree or some piece of entourage and place one. And once you've placed it, you'll notice to the right you have a couple of general modification tools like move, scale, rotate, and change the height. And then next to that we have a context menu or the option to delete it. So if we choose the context menu one and go and select the dot at its origin, and just go to select, you should end up with some tree property panel here. And in there you can do some modifications. Now each object you bring in is going to have different properties that you could tweak. But like in this case, what I do is I just desaturate it, and then I call that a New Mexican tree. A couple little tricks for some of the content is if we select the move tool and we click it and drag it. Now if I just click and drag, what it does is it actually will follow the terrain here. So for example, if I went back into my map and I create like a small hill, and go back to my objects panel, if I click and drag, you'll notice, see how my tree is following the terrain? Now what you'll find is once we start importing our models is that, especially if you have multi-level, that you'll start placing objects on maybe level 2, and as you're moving around and you had stairs or any type of change in elevations, things start to shift and move around. So one little trick, and this is especially true with like placing lights in a scene. So as you start to place lights, they're naturally going to follow the ground where you want them kind of locked in at a ceiling height. What you'll do is when you're holding that, using the move key, if you hold shift, what it does is it locks that height. So now you can see the tree is locked to that last elevation that I had placed it at. And of course, you know, the other tools are pretty self-explanatory. So we have scale. You can kind of click and change those guys. Rotation works well, and you could change the height. And sometimes when you're actually placing entourage in a scene, you'll notice that there's no like numerical values here by default. The way, if you want to get really precise with either how you're moving stuff or even in terms of rotation, because what Lumion will do at this level is just rotate amongst the X kind of axis right there, is you'll see it right here. We have another tab next to the place mode called Move Mode. And if you actually select Move Mode and then you choose your different tools, you'll now have the actual numerical values. So if you need to be precise with anything, here you could actually type in a specific value. You know, if I wanted this actually to be at 0, 0, I could just come in here and hit 0, 0. And now I've got to figure out where I left it. So there's my 0, 0 point in the model. And this is, you know, a lot of times I get questions about how do I rotate an object that's not on that plane. And this is, again, if you go to rotate heading, this is where you start to find kind of the different tools within there and, you know, more precise sizes, positioning, etc. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this object and go back to the place mode. And so we'll jump back into the entourage here in a minute, but let's go ahead and import your models. And so the way that we bring in your models is through the Import tab here. So if you go ahead and select Imports, you'll see the option to import a new model. And at this point, go ahead and browse to the model that you have, whether it's SketchUp or if you... Did you all get the link that I sent to Tim for Rhino to get that into Lumion? No? I believe if you had a Rhino file, you can export as a Kaleida file, and that will allow you to bring in any materials and stuff that you had on the model itself. So in my case, I just made a quick kind of SketchUp Tron type model here. And so in this case, what I did was I just made sure I went through and applied, you know, different kind of materials throughout the model itself. Because what really drives Lumion is really the materials that you've placed on here. Otherwise, when you start to edit it, everything's going to be the same kind of material reference. And it's just going to subtract from the scene itself. So here, I created this random SketchUp model. And so in Lumion, I'm going to go ahead and select that guy and import it. I tend to leave the name as is because what's nice about Lumion is that you could keep updating the original reference. And as long as you're saving over the same file name, you can actually refresh it in Lumion. And if you've gone through the process of adding your own textures and materials, then it's going to update the geometry but keep the material associations. So to import the model, what we'll do is make sure on the left here that you're in the Objects pane. And you're going to want to go to the Imports option here, this folder with the little disk on it. And now select Import New Model. So go to browse to your model and hit Open. And it may take a minute depending on the size. And once you get to this screen, just go ahead and hit Add to Library. Actually, you know what? If you have SketchUp, you may have to save it down to an older version. So why don't we spend a few minutes and get your models in there, and we'll walk around and make sure that you get your stuff loaded. Who needs help getting your model into Lumion? Is everybody good? If you have a jump drive, I could give you this file. Oh, okay. Does it matter where I drop it? Oh, you're so organized, you actually have folders for everything. Oh, there you go. All right. Yep. Does anybody else need a model to work with? It should be exporting as Kaleido format. So I sent this to Tim. He should have it somewhere, but it's export as Kaleido file, the .dae. See if you can do that, and then that should actually pull any materials assignments in Rhino into this format. So once you have your model in there, what we want to do is you may need to kind of adjust it. In my case, my model imported, at the 0, 0 point. So with the import category selected, you should find somewhere in your model an origin point, which is represented by this white dot or this blue dot in this case. But if you don't have it selected, if you choose like one of these move or modification tools, like change height, somewhere in your model you should see it. So you may have to fly around if you have a large model. Otherwise, if you do find that point, you could go ahead and select that and start to manipulate it. So in this case, I'm going to float mine up here and get the model kind of positioned the way I want it. So probably one of the most important steps in Lumion is to actually apply all the Lumion materials to your objects within here. And the way we do that is through the materials menu. So that's the last pane here. So if we go ahead and browse to the left and go ahead and select materials, you'll get the material editor. And as you hover over your model, you'll notice that anything that's shared the same material will highlight. So, in this case, I have a material here, and I've got different materials all throughout the sky. Now, if you didn't assign materials, what will likely happen is your whole model will light up. And so any edits and modifications you do essentially just means that everything's going to be the same material. So that's something you don't want. And if you have that issue, what I'd recommend is I just tend to, in SketchUp, just place a bunch of really random colors on the stuff that I know are going to be unique. I don't spend a lot of time necessarily texturing in SketchUp if I know I'm going to be using Lumion, just because Lumion has so much more in terms of functionality that I don't even mess with that. Is everyone now in a good spot to start adding materials? Okay. So let's go ahead and fly around the model and go ahead and find a material that you want to edit. And go ahead and select it. And once you've selected that, you should get this menu pop up here that's showing you your different, essentially kind of the basic options that you have. And you guys should also see a tab right above here. The resolution on this screen is, oh, there it goes. So you should have nature, indoor, outdoor, and custom. So if you did actually spend a lot of time in another tool texturing and customizing everything on there, what you're likely going to want to do in this case is actually select standard. And what standard does is it'll pull in any materials that were loaded with that model. But now you'll have the added advantage of being able to edit a number of different properties. And so in my case, I just had a plain white surface. And if I go ahead and get it to a good point where I've got some reflection happening here, we can start to look at some of these options. And I'm going to just run through all of these. And they apply whether you have a texture or not. In my case, it's just going to be a plain color. And so first you have your colorization tool. And so you can actually come in here, choose a color spectrum, adjust the brightness of it, etc. In my case, I'm just going to leave it white. But you have a number of controls there. And colorization is really if you have a texture imported, you could start to blend between the two. And so if there is like a wood grain texture that you're trying to turn a different shade, then you use colorization to control that. Yeah. They actually will come in with your models. So as long as you export it as Kaleido file from Rhino, it will pull in textures. Same with Revit will be a Kaleido file, and then it supports the native SketchUp file. So if you had a textured model in SketchUp, you just load the SKP and it'll bring them in. Here we have glossiness, so we can adjust that. I tend to actually increase it more so for the final rendering versus what you see in this editor mode. It tends to not necessarily reflect kind of that final render quality, especially if you have other lighting within the environment. We have reflectivity. So in my case, it's kind of subtle on the screen, but if I turned up gloss and reflectivity, it'd essentially become a mirror. But you can start to see some of the clouds. Can you see that on the monitor? Okay. So that gives you somewhat of a preview in terms of how reflective a particular surface is going to be. If you did bring in a texture map, you can play with the bump map settings. And so if you're in SketchUp, you can add a bump map, but what it does is when it brings it into Lumion, it'll actually create one for you automatically. And so you could play with the relief, and then you can adjust scale as well. And I'm going to actually go through an example of loading a custom texture here in a minute, but let me go ahead and get through these kind of examples here. The big one for my environment, because I'm working on the Tron one, is I want to add a lot of like emissive materials, kind of like these glowing strips of light. So in this case, I've actually created a material here. I call it emissive LED. And I'm going to go ahead and select standard. And below your general tools, you'll notice you have a bunch of tabs here. And so one of those tabs is the settings. And so under settings, you'll see you have emissive, saturation, specular, flicker reduction, etc. And so here I'm just going to go ahead and crank up my emission. And because it's Tron, I'm going to kind of choose kind of this cyan type color here. And in this case, you notice I'm using the editor mode in a daylit environment. So what I'm actually going to do is once I've made a change to a material, the way that we save that is you should see a big checkbox here on the right. So if you look down to the lower right, any edits that you made to those materials you can save. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save. And in my case, I'm going to go to the weather and just change it to like a kind of an evening type shot, just so I could start to see the effect of the emissive colors there. So here I've got some emissive lights in the scene, and now I'm going to go back to the editor mode, select that material, and now I can kind of make my final tweaks. So, you could really blow it out here or do something a little more subtle, which I'm going to do in this case. And a lot of these other settings, if you find yourself in a situation where you have like overlapping geometry or geometry that's like on the same plane, what you'll notice is, and I didn't see it in this model, but if you're flying around your model and you're seeing like a lot of flickering on the material itself, that's because the geometry was too close. And so that's where this flicker reduction tool comes in handy. So if you see those instances in your model, go ahead and select that material and then apply the flicker reduction, and it'll actually kind of fake an offset to that so that you don't get that weird effect within there. The last couple effects are kind of funky, but I've actually used them on some historic renovation projects. But if I go back to my frosted glass texture here, and I go to weathering, you can actually add kind of a weathered look to the materials as well. And so what it's doing is it's just looking for edges of geometry and then starts to apply these like kind of color mask on top of them. And so there's like a stone. You can look at like different material samples in terms of how they'll weather on a particular surface. In my case, I have no need for this one in this environment, but if you're doing like an older project or you want to add a little grit to the model or context, that's a pretty cool way to do it. The last one there, you can actually add, you know, some types of foliage and leaves to the surfaces. I'm not really going to mess with that one either. So let's look at a few other options within the material editor outside of the custom parameters. So like in this case, maybe I want to add a stone material or something. So if I select it, rather than using the custom toolset on the top here, you'll see there's a number of preset materials. And so we have outdoor, indoor, and nature. So in my case, I'm going to go to indoor. I'm going to choose the tile category. And then you'll see, just like the entourage tabs, you have a number of pages of different materials within here. And so you can actually come in here and find a specific material that you want to use and go ahead and select that. And then you'll start to get that texture in there. So this one looks like a herringbone type texture. And these are, again, these start as the base, but then you go back to that same editor mode where you can really fine tune and tweak a lot of this. So here's kind of more of a gridded texture, which will be good to demo. And if you guys notice, anywhere you see these polygon, these tend to be the higher resolution texture files. And if you hover over it, you'll actually see the resolution on the end there. So this one, if you look at the end of that description, says 2K. So that's pretty high res. There's 3K. And I believe there's even some 4K images in there. If it doesn't have that, that's just like a standard, 1024 to 512 texture. And so it's going to be a little bit lower quality texture, but I tend to find a lot of these polygons work for the purposes we need. And here in a moment, I'll show you how to deal with some real custom textures. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and leave that grid. And then I'm going to go ahead and kind of click out of there. And now you'll notice within that editor mode that you'll see the texture here. And it has its kind of diffuse map and normal map, your typical settings. But now if we start to play with the gloss and scale, you'll actually see, something happening versus a plain white. So here I can start to adjust the scale of the actual material. And a little trick here when you're messing with scale, sometimes, if I wanted to get like the grid to line up with the geometry, there's a couple of ways we can do that. One trick is if you actually, when you're moving this slider, you'll often find yourself in a point where you're like trying to get like 2.1 or something, and you're like moving and it keeps jumping around. You notice as I click it, the shift button is highlighted. If you actually hold that, it'll allow you to do a really subtle kind of shift within there. And so if I wanted like 4, I could actually jump over while holding shift and kind of get it as close to 4 as possible, and it tends to just round to that next number. Relief will actually play with the bump map. And if I had the sun, let me move the sun up a little bit. Let's get some sunlight on there. Now, I don't know if you guys can see, it's very subtle, but it's trying to kind of create the illusion that there's depth to the material. Yeah, I don't really see it on the monitor. But that's a good way, especially if you have like a wood floor or a texture that you want it to appear that it's actually 3D without going through the process of modeling it. That's where the bump maps come in handy, and that's where you'll use the relief tool. But here I can actually change the glossiness of it. Actually, can you guys see the texture a little better now? Now if I mess with the relief, notice how it just looks like a flat texture with nothing? Can you guys see that in the sunlight now? That's what the relief is going to do to that. And then again, that colorization, because we have a texture now, you know, if I wanted to change the color, that's where this slider works. So now I could choose something. And then through the slider, you could either start to kind of slowly blend that to the texture or keep it at the original image. We can also tweak, you know, the general layout of any texture in Lumion as well. So if we go over to position on the bottom here, you have your X offset. So this is where you'll start to kind of slide your textures around to get them lined up as you need them. So we can actually, if I really wanted this thing lined up, I could come in here, use that shift key to just fine tune it, and now you can see my texture map is lined with the edge of that geometry. So you've got your general position. You could also rotate the texture if you needed to. Yeah, so those are pretty much your basic kind of texture tools. And now Lumion imports, and I'm not sure which version the school has, but it comes with like 500 custom textures, and you can typically find what you need. The one issue that we run into often is that our textures are literal like materials that are existing out there, and we need to match those exactly. And oftentimes, when we're looking for like a reference image, we can't find anything at a high enough quality. Like all the manufacturers will give you like a thumbnail that's like 10 pixels, and it just looks terrible when you load it into Lumion or another software. So we often find ourselves kind of having to create custom textures for our projects, and I expect the same will happen, you know, with you guys as well as you're looking at your own projects. I'm going to show you a workflow that we use in our office, just because I know you can get this software. It's called Substance, and it essentially allows you to create any texture that you want with no reference image. It's a really powerful texture tool. I could probably spend a week kind of training you on how to do that, but what's nice about Substance is that there's a thing called Substance Source. So here it is. I'll send Tim a link to it, but I looked it up and you can get a free version for yourselves. And if you go to like Substance Source, which is essentially like a repository for a bunch of pre-built materials that they have. Let's see. So here, this is called Substance Source. And what's cool about Source is that you can essentially take almost any of these textures and patterns and create something completely new out of them. So it gives you like the parameters to tweak, edit, and mold any of these things to what you want. Or you can actually create something completely from scratch. Wow, the internet is like so slow. It's not even loading the preview. Anyway, once you're on Source, if you just Google it, you'll see all kinds of cool textures that you can use. And as a student, if you download what's called Substance Player, which is this guy, what it'll allow you to do is take these custom substances, they call them, and actually tweak all the different parameters. So for example, if I go to open, you know, here I've downloaded a couple of different ones. Let's see what this is. So let me try. Okay, so this one was called Metal Bricks. And if I look at it here and zoom in, it gives you a nice preview mode so you could start to look at the material properties, how light is going to interact with that surface. But what we find is that, we always have to tweak everything. And so on the right here, we have a whole number of presets that we can start to edit and manipulate. So if I wanted to actually change the number of bricks, you could see here I've got brick number, brick spacing. So I could actually start to edit that. I could change the spacing of the bricks. I can do different patterns within there. There's so many options within them, and all of them are very different. So it's always fun to play with these. Here we could look at the roughness. So you could see how the light is actually going to bounce off that. So if it has 0 roughness, it's more like a mirrored type material or something a little softer. In my case, because I'm doing like a Tron thing, I'm just going to go ahead and build like a kind of interesting brick pattern that's going to be on the floor. So one, maybe I'm going to make my actual mortar glow or be somewhat kind of emissive or look a little bit different. So here I could see I can actually edit brick color and mortar color. And so here I'm just going to do something weird and kind of choose a cyan color. So we can now see that it has that cyan within the mortar itself. And as I zoom in there, we can start to see there's a number of details within at a very fine level. But one of the most important things, especially if you guys get into that, is to actually change the output size. So here it's a really low resolution image. It's 512 pixels. I can actually crank that up to 1K or 2K or 4K image. And if you pay attention to the detail here, as you kind of jump that up to maybe a 2K, notice how much sharper, and now you can start to see these very fine, subtle details within the texture itself. So we tend to actually use 2K textures on our stuff within the office. And from there, now we can really start to look at, what are the different effects here. So here I've got a panel for metal scratches. And if you guys look here, you can kind of see it there, but, we can actually increase, decrease, how rough that is, the intensity of the scratch. Is it intentional? Is it like a brushed type metal? Or are we just trying to add a somewhat weathered appearance to it? We could edit the mortar detail within there as well. There's even like a little bevel that's in there. I could turn that down. The height of the mortar, we can start to adjust. The patina. So if I really crank that up, you guys, it's very subtle. Hopefully you can see it on the screen, but you can see a little bit of a weathered type look. And so this allows us to fine tune that as much as possible. And so I think you guys get the point. You go through, you essentially take these substances and you tweak all the settings to make it what you want. And once you're done, you can actually take these guys into Lumion. And this is a little kind of secret that we do. It's not documented very well, so I'll kind of send you guys a link or a reference to it. But let me go ahead and just finalize my texture here. So I just want to have a real thin joint. And I'm going to make this more like a black texture. All right, so say that's the texture that I'm wanting for my tiles. What we'll do now is actually export this guy. Do you guys have Photoshop on these computers too? Okay. So in this case, I'm going to export, and I'm actually going to choose the diffuse channel, the normal, and the glossiness channel. And we always want to export as a TGA file because that contains all the depth information and alpha information as well, better than PNG or other formats tend to. So here I've selected a folder. And I'm going to go ahead and export. So I'll send you guys a link that goes into detail about how to do this, just because you would have to download Substance on your own. But it looks like those are complete. And so if you start using Lumion a lot, there's a little secret here that I'm going to show you guys. So first, what tends to happen is that when you find a texture, it's often, if you're not using like Substance, you're not going to get a normal map or any other maps that tell the program how light's going to bounce off it or how to handle the roughness, etc. So what Lumion will do by default, if you don't have that tool or don't have the time to find it or do anything, is that you can actually just bring in any texture image you want and it'll create a relief map for you. So if we select, again, my brick here, rather than using the one that's actually in the material library, if you actually select choose color map here, or actually let me set that. So I'm just going to start again. So this is just a standard material with no texture associated with it. And that's just under the custom tab, your standard material. So what I'm going to do is select choose color map. And in this case, I'm going to choose that diffuse channel, but in your case, you may just have a JPEG or some PNG file of a texture that you found. And once that imports, you can see it's on here now. So what Lumion did is it actually generated a normal map for me. So now, just with the plain texture, I can actually come in and tweak. That depth map as needed. I could come in and adjust the scale. But you'll notice, like, if you look at the glossiness of it, see how it's just this flat plane of gloss? Like, it's not really picking up a ton of those, like, kind of subtle details that we had in Substance. And so what we need to do is actually take that channel, that glossiness channel that we generated, and apply it to the diffuse material and the normal map that we had created from Substance Designer. So Lumion does a decent job, but let's go ahead and go through a little bit of a different workflow if we want to really be precise about the materials that we're assigning to the model. So the trick is to actually open up Photoshop. Excuse me. And under here, what I'm going to do is actually load my normal map and the glossiness map. And so this is what a normal map looks like. And a normal map, if you're not familiar, is just basically telling the program like kind of how to fake the height and depth of a particular material. And you'll notice that Lumion doesn't have a channel for glossiness. So the secret is that it actually contains the glossiness information within one of the normal channels in this texture here. So if you're in Photoshop, what you do is you're actually going to take that glossiness map, this guy, and you're going to go into your normal map, and under the layers and channels, you have your typical RGB channel. But what you're actually going to do here is add an alpha channel. And here we're going to actually paste that glossiness map. So now we've got the glossiness applied to an alpha channel within the normal map that we generated in Substance. And I'm going to go ahead and do a file, save as, and I'm going to call this normal gloss. We want to make sure to do a target format and make sure that alpha channels is checked. And here I want to do 32-bit and not compressed. So now with that guy, I can go ahead and choose my normal map. There's my normal gloss. And now we'll start to get a lot of those finer details that we had created kind of in Lumion. So now you could start to see the scratches and the other very subtle effects within there. So that's a pretty advanced workflow for materials. I just throw it out there so that if you are in the situation where you're really relying on custom materials, is to really look at Substance as an option. And there's tons of tutorials out there, and because you can get a free student license, I think if anything, it's worth downloading the Substance player and going to Substance source to get something close to what you want, and then just use all those parameters within there to actually tweak and get it closer to exactly what you need for your particular project. So why don't, if you haven't done so already, just spend about 5 minutes and just kind of fly around the model and assign Lumion materials to everything. And then we'll go through the kind of next step of artificial lighting and setting up some camera views. And go ahead and raise your hand if you have questions, or if you're still struggling to get your model into Lumion. All right, does everyone have at least a few materials assigned? Okay. So let's go back to the component editor, or actually the object mode. So if you kind of hover to the left, just beneath materials, we have objects here. And let's go and take a look at a few of these categories just so we can get this across. So I'm going to add a couple people to my scene. And so I'm going to go to people and animals. And once you select this option, you just got to make sure to select the tab here. So they've got a lot of random kind of people within here. They're all pretty creepy. In fact, we've been banned from using them in our renderings because clients will come back and they're too creeped out by them. So we now are photoshopping a lot of these guys. But nonetheless, if you need them, they're kind of cool. And typically these AXYZ models are like the better models. And if we select one, for example, you know, they have some animation kind of baked into them, and they do some interesting stuff. That what we've actually been doing lately is just, rather than focusing on the weird people and detracting from the architecture, is we sometimes will essentially take this color, this object properties mode, and we've noticed some models don't have this functionality, which is weird, but if it does, what you can actually do is just either like make it a black silhouette or a white silhouette. And so I tend to kind of just make them these white silhouettes. If anything, they become like good reference tools. So sometimes what we'll do is we'll place a bunch of people in a scene and render out that shot. And then we'll render another scene without the same people, but use them for a point of reference for scale, so that when we're photoshopping, we could actually get the scale right as they're kind of seen in the distance from the camera position. And when we're also doing this type of stuff, we also like to utilize the layers, because we have models, especially when we look at like larger site developments, we have some models that have like 10,000 trees, for example. And so that can start to bog down a model. And the one feature I haven't really touched on yet is the layering on top. So if you actually hover your mouse to the top, you'll see a number of layers here. And so in this case, I'm going to go ahead and select layer 2. And I'm going to name that entourage. And what we do is, in order to get them in there, you have to have them selected. So when you don't have an object selected, you'll see a white dot here. And you could either control-click to grab a whole number of objects at once. If you just have one, you could just click it. And if you have a bunch of them that you can't really do the selection tool in one shot, what you can actually do is select it, use this context menu option, and then you have a few other options. So you could select everything in that category. If it's a number of the same object, you could select all the identical ones. So it's essentially like a select all tool. So here I'm going to select all in category, which is still 1. And then what I need to do is just hover up to the layer I want it on, and you'll see this option to move selection to layer. I'm going to go ahead and select that, and then just by turning it off and on, that's just my way to validate that the objects were moved to where they need to be. So it's a nice feature to use, especially if you start to add a bunch of stuff to your models and you're not maybe running on the most high performance computer, that you could actually turn a lot of that stuff off when you don't need it and then just turn it on when you're rendering. I'll show you one final note on the objects here before we jump into lighting. And this is more true with a lot of the nature elements. And so if I went in here and I select a tree, let me find something. So if I bring in a tree, oftentimes, you know, if you're placing a lot of a particular object, you could either just manually just copy and move it around, or you can use this mass placement tool. And so mass placement is right beneath, for some reason it's like blocking. Can you guys see there's like a little green option beneath? this place mode. So if you select mask placement, what you'll do is you'll get essentially like a placement point with an arrow on it. So what you'll do is you'll click your first point, drag, and then choose your second point. And once you've done that, you'll notice you have a number of options there. So you should have like a general path in terms of what you're placing. And so here we could actually adjust the number of items that are on that path. So oftentimes we'll actually use this for people. So if we have sidewalks everywhere and we want to populate it with people or cars, what we'll do is we'll kind of create a mask placement object. And then you'll notice here, you can actually continually add other elements within that. So here I've got like 3 different trees on here. So I can place those on there. And so what I could do is increase, the number of them. Then you could start to mess with the direction. But what we tend to do is, for especially nature elements, is randomize the direction of them. So they're not all placed the same. And with people, what we do is once we have a line of people, if you could imagine, or let's do this. Oh, stuck to that category. But what we'll do is actually do a random offset from that line. So if you could imagine this is people on a sidewalk, you kind of offset them so they're not all walking in a straight line. And then you could even randomize along the placement of that. So we just don't want anything to look so perfect that it's just so unnatural. And so mask placement is a great way to do that. What's that? You would just select them all and then go to your context menu and then change the setting there. We also use this for like parking lots too. So if we need to place a bunch of cars, we'll just draw a mask placement line, kind of orient them the right direction, and then just increase the number until it fills the parking spaces. And then what we tend to do is once we've done that mask placement, is that we'll actually then further randomize by just deleting, a couple random ones within there, so that it's not so consistent. And the final little trick is what I'll do is I'll actually select all of these holding the control key. And with all of these guys selected, I'll go to the context menu, transformation, and then here I can actually randomize position, rotation, or both. And then I typically just randomize at 30%. And then it further kind of increases the randomness, especially for nature elements in a particular environment. So I'm going to remove that. And just one note, when you are like moving and placing different types of entourage in a scene, it's all contextual to which tab you have highlighted here. So what does that mean? So if I came in here and I added some people, and I want to move this tree, you'll notice that when I have the Move tool selected, only the people have an element to actually control and the trees do not. So in order to start to move different types of entourage, you just got to jump to the correct categories. So here if I went to nature, now you'll see I have the ability to move the trees around, but I can't touch the people. So you just got to keep that in mind as you're updating and editing stuff that you're on the right category. Even when deleting objects too. So that's a lot of the just basic kind of entourage stuff in a nutshell. The other elements that we want to look at are the lighting. So if we go ahead and look on the bottom right, you should see lights and special objects. And let's go ahead and select that. And so here you'll get a number of different kind of IES profiled lights. I have a couple pages of them. we tend to just find what we need out of this selection here, but let's go ahead and click on one of these lights to look at it in detail. So I'm going to place a light here. And of course it drops it on the floor, so what we'll have to do is with it selected, go ahead and select that change height option. And let's go ahead and lift that up. And now I can start to see a little bit of my light showing on this surface here. So with the light selected, what I tend to do is I'll actually kind of tweak one light really well so it looks good for that scene. And then I end up copying this guy all around the environment. So here we have a number of different light properties that we can do. So you have option for brightness. So here we can start to tweak the brightness. We could adjust the cone angle. Now if we want something really sharp or a little bit softer, you could actually change the color of the light if you want to. Show light source is good, when you're doing a lot of like can lighting or something in the ceiling where you're going to look up and you're going to want to actually see the source of light. And like if you're doing recessed lighting, we tend to actually add a emissive material inside the can itself so that it appears to glow. But you could also turn on show light source, and then you'll start to get this little guy here. And the reason why we tend to use the material is that we can adjust it and control the level of emissive, versus this guy, it's kind of set in stone. You could also do a day and night activation, and this is good for your shadows. So if you have like an interior scene at night and you've got a nice camera placement, you tend to want to use really high shadow options here. But if it's like a general lighting environment, like a parking lot that you're seeing in a distance, we tend to use the lower kind of static or these medium type shadows, just so that it doesn't use too much RAM when processing. The final light option is more targeted. So if you're doing more like an uplight, so let's say I wanted to light these pillars. If I take that guy, actually not. So I'm going to copy this one. So there's a couple ways to do it. I mean, you could go to your move tool and start, precisely kind of moving it up and down as you need to, or you could use the target light tool, which then just follows your mouse like a flashlight. And so you could actually come in here, and actually set really specific points of light, as you need them. So that's a good kind of second option in terms of like really fine-tuning where your lights are going to be positioned in a scene. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And like I told you earlier, if you do have lights in your environment, make sure that you hold Shift. And if you actually hold the Alt key at the same time, you're going to create a copy. So this allows you to just lock in those heights and copy all that same light setting that you had created in that original model. So that's kind of a general overview of those lights, and there's a few other lighting properties that we can look at as well. So if I go back to place mode, go back to your lights and objects, here we have Omni light, area lights, and then reflection probes and a few other effects that you can add to the scene. Now light fill is good in combination, I believe, with other spotlights. But this just creates like a general kind of light source. And we oftentimes will use that, if we have a building in the distance or maybe a light source that's really far away and we're not so concerned with shadows, but rather just to get some illumination in a particular scene. And these guys will just shoot light in all directions. And, it's not a very great effect in the end, but if you need to do it, or when you have a situation where you have spotlights, say I've got a couple spotlights here, but maybe the contrast or the shadows between two of them is just too high. then you could use this to start to soften kind of the in-between there and really kind of nail down, you know, the specific light quality that you're trying to get. And the last one are area lights. So area lights are more like an LED type source, you know, in this case. So like here, I can actually come in, turn on the light source. And so now I could see this guy. So this one you actually can adjust the length, kind of the width. We could tweak the fallout of it. And of course the brightness. I think area lights are really useful when you're doing an interior scene with windows and you want to really control the amount of light that's coming into an environment. And so what I tend to do is actually take area lights and I'll take them right outside a window of a building. See, so I've got an opening right here. And what I'll do is I'll go to my move mode, which gives me a little more flexibility. And then I can go ahead and start to adjust this guy. So I'm going to place that. And I'm going to rotate it so it's facing inward. And what I'm going to do here is actually I'm going to try and get it centered. Just the height. And then the only thing we need to do is actually, you know, if I wanted to leave that light source, I could, or you could actually turn that off, but now you get that light quality bleeding into the window. And here you can actually control it a lot better. So here I could do that, or I can, you know, tweak the color as I need to. But I think you get the point. You know, if you've got a light source and maybe the sun isn't a direct shot into the window that you need to still illuminate a scene well, that's where a lot of these area lights come in handy. All right, so that pretty much covers your general tools that you're going to use to prep a particular scene for. Now, the final kind of step, and probably the most important, is actually setting up either the photo or the animation in Lumion. In our case, we're going to actually do a panorama, but I'll just quickly show you a couple of these options here. So photo mode on the right, lower right, is essentially where you'll kind of do your still shots if you're not doing any rendering. So if I wanted to do like a cool kind of money shot, come over here. Now what you do in this mode is it has the same navigation as your editor mode. So you fly around, you kind of set up the shot, and then you take a picture by storing the camera. And once you have your camera stored, you know, you could tweak things like the focal length. I tend to use like 25 range. Or you could be really dramatic and pull it back. I think it starts at like 15. So once you're happy with where the camera positioned, go ahead and save that shot. And now what it comes down to is really stacking like several effects to create the desired scene that you want. Now with Lumion 8, what version are you guys running? Do you have 8? Okay. So you should have custom styles. So custom styles essentially bundles like a lot of effects into something that you could just start to edit much easier. So if I was to choose like an effect like interior, what it does is it's added all these kind of different effects on here. And with each of those, you could actually click on it and start to adjust kind of the various settings there. Or another thing you can do is just the manual process. So here I've stored a camera, but rather than doing styles, you can choose add effects. And now you'll get this whole effect stack. So remember earlier I said we don't really use the sun in the editor environment. So in this case, what we actually do is we'd apply a sun study. And now with that, you can actually see you've got all kinds of effects. So you can actually change the hour, the minute of the day, time zone, etc. And what you end up doing is taking some of these effects and just continually stacking them. So here I've got sun. Here I'll actually, start to tweak the shadow, interior, exterior. You can control kind of the omni shadow within there. And you'll essentially go through and continually adding effects. So, you could do like a depth of field camera, kind of keep that background out of focus. You could do some lens flare effects. So here, if we look at like anywhere I have an emissive material, you could start to really control, the bloom. If I change my sun study, kind of more of an evening shot, and then go to my lens flare. So here I can start to fine tune that, or you could do like the Michael Bay kind of lens flares that are, shooting out of every Transformer movie ever. But you can just see the level of control that you have within here. So I think a lot of the magic in terms of like your final shots or your final animation is going to happen within this environment. And there's tons of different effects to kind of pick and choose from. Sky and cloud, we could actually, control a lot of this stuff. Now, some of these apply more to the movie mode, which I'll show you here in a second, like position. You kind of get the point. So you'll go through, you'll do effects. There's even more abstract kind of versions. So if you maybe early in your design process and you don't have materials, or you don't want to have hard edges and you want to keep it conceptual, you can certainly find some type of effect to soften up the rendering or make it look a little more sketchy. And if you don't like an effect, you can either disable it temporary or just double click to actually remove it. So that's essentially the photo mode. You kind of just run around, take a bunch of shots, set it up. And one thing to keep in mind is that if you find a setup that you like, so say I spent an hour kind of tweaking all of these settings to make them perfect, what you can actually do is then just apply that to others. So if I decided, I have this shot here, or maybe kind of more of another shot right there. So if I spend a lot of time in this one, what you'll notice on the top here is a little menu button. And you can actually take that guy, go to Edit, Copy Effects, and then you could just go to Edit and Paste Effects. So now it's going to take that same effect stack that we did and apply it to my other renderings. And then, of course, you could actually go in and then just fine-tune them. So here, maybe, that brightness is a little too much. Or I want to add, like a lens dirt or some other effect on top of that. You get to kind of give yourself a head start rather than going through every single shot and kind of choosing different effects. And the only big difference between like photo mode and movie mode is that in movie mode, you'll actually kind of choose point A and point B for your different cameras, or several points. And so what we do in this case is you'll actually select record. And so we'll kind of start to move the camera around and just start taking snapshots at different points in time. So say I want a shot where I kind of warp through this thing. I don't even know what it is. So I could kind of take photo. And then what I'm going to do is actually just move the camera to the next point. And so now I've got a point A, point B. I can actually continue to add points to that. And on the upper left here, you'll see I've got a time duration, clip duration. So here you can actually control the speed of that. So here I could go from maybe 6 seconds to maybe a little bit slower. I'll make that a 10-second clip duration and hit play. And then we could start to see what that animation looks like. So I could be happy with that one. I'll hit save. And then it looks very much like the photo mode where you have these empty slots. But then what you could do is just add scenes. So maybe what I'll do is actually click this, go to the end of this scene, and pick up from that point. And maybe I'll do like a panning shot here. So I'm going to delete that. So here I'm going to take a photo, and then I'm just going to pan across. So I tend to like go through like almost like a film and kind of create shots and scenes. And then you'll notice on the left you have entire movie. So if you select that, this line represents the first scene and the second scene. And so then we could actually see what the final full animation would look like based on a number of different scenes within there. And so unique to the movie mode is there's actual kind of transition effects that you can also apply, so that rather than doing a hard split between the different scenes, you could add maybe like a fade or some other effect on top of that. So there's a fade in and out. Here you could kind of choose the duration. So there's a softer fade in. And then when we're going to go to the shot, so maybe on the end of the first clip, I'd actually add like a fade to black. So it's just more kind of a seamless transition between the two shots. And something important in this mode is, you can certainly go clip by clip and tweak the effects. And in some cases, you may need to based on where your camera was in that particular shot. But if there's something that applies globally, like the sun position, or, if you want clouds to kind of animate across the entire animation, what you want to do is actually select the entire movie mode. And then you can apply effects on top of that there as well. So here we could go to Add Effect, and maybe I'm going to have the kind of clouds move across the scene. So here I'm going to select clouds. And the big difference here is that in the movie mode, we actually have the ability to add keyframes. So you'll notice this little squiggly line on the end of every option here that essentially allows us to save some setting in a moment in time. And so here I'm at the beginning of the clip, so I'm going to go ahead and lock in the keyframe there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move my cursor to the end, and I'm going to add another keyframe here, but I'm going to actually change the position setting. So what that should do is actually allow this little scene to animate. So now if we play that, you guys see the clouds moving now? And so just looking at all the different effect stacks, oftentimes, people will move the sun so it ends in a very dramatic type fashion. But you'll see a number of effects just in movie mode will have that ability to actually keyframe and change those points in time. And a kind of last thing that I think you should be aware of is that before we render our 360 pano shot is when we're actually rendering these. So here I am in photo mode. If we want to render a picture, what you'll do is you'll go to the end here and you'll see render photos. And when you select that, you have these default kind of resolutions. In fact, those are your only choices. We tend to render either the print or poster version, and we render it as like the raw format. So you can get a compressed JPEG, but what we do is we'll take it into Photoshop and tweak a lot of the colors and levels within there. So we tend to use the BMP file. They can get large, so they could be 40 megabyte renderings, etc. I'm not going to render this one out. I'll just render it as a JPEG. And you can see they're pretty quick. So here it is rendering and taking a lot of those samples. So in this case, it did 64 samples and rendered it in like a second or two. So there's that shot. Now early on, what I was doing was I was adding reflections to the materials because I wanted it to be a very glossy kind of environment. And you notice that that didn't really come through on this. And so one of the things that always gets people hung up with, especially when they want reflectivity in a scene, is that you actually have to add an effect in here for reflection. So it's one of the first effects, and you'll see reflection here. And what we'll want to do is actually enable that, and now you'll actually see the reflected surfaces being calculated. And so you could do a, kind of high quality reflection. And so all of this reflection setting goes back to that material where you're tweaking the glossiness. And one of the nice things to do that I tend to do, especially with reflection, is you can actually go to build mode with these effects applied. And if you look here on the top, you'll see build with effects. So now it has all those same effects that I've applied, but now I could go to my material mode, and now I can actually change and tweak the glossiness of this to get kind of the desired look that I'm looking for. So maybe I want it slightly reflective but still sharp. I can make those tweaks and then jump back into the movie mode, and now when I render it, I'm going to get something closer to what I was looking for. A few other notes on the render. You could actually do the full photo set. So rather than going one by one, you'll just render everything out at once. And if we go to movie mode, there's a few other options in there. So if we render movie, you could choose your output quality, your frames per second, and then your resolution. So this will automatically compress it to like an MP4. They tend to do pretty well. The renderings can take a lot of time, depending on the level that you're doing. And what we've started to do, because sometimes we'll kick off a rendering and it crashes overnight or Windows Update runs and you lose all your work, is that we've been rendering as image sequences. And so what's great about this is that you can actually hit render, and if something happens over the course of 8 hours and it crashes, you can actually just pick up the rendering where it left off. And so you could actually come in here and specify a range. So if it got to like 200, we could say, okay, start at 201 and then finish at the end. And then you can take those last frames and kind of stitch it together in your photo editing software. If you have the latest version of Lumion, you can also export different maps. So they'll all always render with this cloud environment, but you may have a different environment that you want to add. So in that case, you are probably going to want to export, one of the alpha maps. So it'll basically black out the whole sky. So then you could just take that into Photoshop and then cut it out and swap it with your own background. For the movies, we tend to keep at 30 frames per second. We've just found whenever we've rendered higher that some computers can't even run it. No, this is a literal like MP4 that you'll play on your desktop. So let's actually do the VR one now. So the last option here is Panorama. So if we go ahead and select that, why don't you go ahead and zoom in your model. So click in this viewport here and just find a spot where you want to take your kind of 360. And just think about as you look up, down, and to the side, it's going to capture everything. So if we go to, maybe I'm going to choose kind of a point right here. In my case, it's a little hard to get the height right because I'm built some weird thing that's just floating in the sky. But if yours is actually on the ground, you can actually set your height. And then you could kind of, so in that case, it dropped me down. So here I'm going to want to go back up. But one option that is nice is to just kind of level that horizontal eye level, so then it kind of keeps it perfectly horizontal. Okay, so there's my scene I've set up, and now what you want to make sure to do is store that viewport with the camera option. And once you've done that, you'll see a few options here, and we can still add different effects on top of this scene. And in the case of VR mode, you are limited to some of these guys. So, I'm going to turn on reflections because I want that in the shot. I could adjust the exposure a little bit. So, add a few effects if you need them. And what we're going to do now is go select this VR Panorama Mode. And you'll have a number of options here. For the sake of time, what we'll want to do is do a draft version. And we can turn on the stereoscopic. I'm going to leave that on. And what we're going to do is upload to that RoundMe site I showed you guys at the beginning of class. So we're going to use the generic VR device. And I'm going to use the lower resolution, just so it'll actually render in the next minute or so. So once you've got those settings up and running, you're going to get and hit Start Rendering. And I'm going to add Save Location. As a warning, there's a significant time difference between draft and production mode. So like this thing will render in a minute, where production mode could take like 4 hours per shot. So keep that in mind if you're in a time crunch. And the difference between draft and production isn't that significant that oftentimes we'll just keep it at draft mode. So what it's going to do is render first the left eye, and then it's going to render the right eye. And while that's running, I'm going to go back to that RoundMe tool. And if you have RoundMe open, or if you're able to create a password, you'll essentially just get this option to create a tour. And it's super simple. You literally just drag and drop your image onto the website. So let me let that finish. Okay. So there it is. So that's kind of your left and right eye. And if it's happy, it should just take that guy and drop it on. So let it process. Okay, once it's on, you can go to entitle it. If it's an actual location, you can actually add all kinds of information to your panos, and you can. What's cool is you can upload multiple scenes and actually warp to them too. So you could actually walk through your whole project through these mobile VR type platforms. In our case, we just have one rendering, so I'm going to hit save. And you'll get an editor mode, and you can add different kind of hot shots, panoramic locations, etc. But you can see what it does is it allows you to kind of view it in 360. And if we go to the viewer mode, we could turn on web VR mode. And so this is where when you have your actual, if you load this site onto your mobile phone, it will load this, and that's where you'll actually plug this into like the Google Cardboard, and it'll actually create a little bit of depth in the image so it doesn't look so flat. And that's pretty much the process to kind of generate a lot of these quick 360 type VR views for your projects. Like here's an example that we did for Symphony Tower. And in this case, we actually had multiple 360 renderings that we had generated. And so what we did is in the headset, we have all these hotspots. So if you click on them, it'll actually warp you to different locations. And so RoundMe allows you to, one, navigate on the website, but when you're actually in the mobile headset, when you look at those little points, you'll see a loading screen run, and then it'll warp you to all the different locations within there. So it's a pretty cool way to get some stuff out really quickly when you need it. And it's free until you reach a certain number of uploads, but I haven't even hit that point yet. So cool. Well, that's it in a nutshell. I know I went fast, but I know it was recording. So I think they're going to share this recording with you guys, I imagine, at some point. But otherwise, if you have questions, feel free to email me. I have my email address there. But I'm going to send Tim a bunch of links to some of these more in-depth tutorials with like Substance, how to do materials, how to bring them into Lumion. And then I'll also send you guys like the Lumion kind of quick shortcut commands and stuff like that that allows you to just fly around your model really quickly. With that, we got 10 minutes. Do you guys have any questions? I know this is probably like information overload on a Monday morning. Yeah. Not right now. Lumion 9 is coming out in like a couple weeks, and we're hoping that they've expanded the VR kind of options, one in terms of like actually using a full headset and navigating the model, and doing like a video type VR. Although those experiences also can be nauseating too, if you've tried them. All right, cool. Well, thanks for your time, guys. Hopefully this gave you at least some idea of, the capabilities of Lumion and an option to showcase your projects in a new way. Next week, Jaime will be the host, and he's going to be doing Unreal Studio. And that's going to allow you to then leverage like a full Oculus headset, navigate and move around the environment versus the mobile type VR that Lumion's capable of.